Imagine it is 1600 AD. The smoke from the Battle of Sekigahara has finally settled, leaving the landscape looking like a discarded charcoal sketch. The Tokugawa shogunate is now in charge, turning Japan into a giant, disciplined, and very grumpy office space where the rules are strict, the tea is bitter, and the punishment for a misplaced sandal is usually a public execution. Meet Kenji. Kenji is a samurai. In theory, he is a killing machine, a blur of steel and honor, destined to carve his name into the annals of history with a blade forged in the fires of hell. In reality, he is the only man in feudal Japan who uses his heirloom katana to trim his hedges and his delicate, hand-carved tea whisk to perform emergency surgery on dying daisies. His flaw? He is absolutely terrified of blood. The metallic, copper tang of it makes his knees buckle, and the sight of a fresh wound causes him to swoon with the grace of a fainting Victorian poet. You see, most samurai define their success by the number of heads they collect in a campaign. Kenji defines his success by the number of blooming cherry blossoms in his private courtyard. When he draws his blade, it is usually to politely prune a stray branch, which, as you can imagine, makes him very unpopular with the guys who want to overthrow the government and establish a new order of blood-soaked tyranny. Can a man who cries at the sight of a paper cut survive the most violent century in Japanese history? Let's find out. Being a samurai in 1600 wasn't just about having cool hair and a sharp sword. It was a 24/7 job of looking stoic, eating cold rice, and occasionally getting disemboweled if you looked at a daimyo's cat the wrong way. Kenji was raised in the way of the warrior, Bushido. It's a code of conduct that emphasizes loyalty, courage, and being ready to die at a moment's notice. Kenji took the ready-to-die part to heart, but only because he was genuinely worried about who would water his moss if he wasn't around to do it. His father was a legendary warlord who once killed a man with a wooden toothpick. Kenji, meanwhile, was sent to a prestigious academy where he accidentally learned how to cross-pollinate orchids instead of how to perform a perfect harakiri. In a world where your status is determined by your ability to be a human blender, Kenji was basically a sentient gardening glove. His peers were busy sharpening spears and reciting poems about death. Kenji was busy arguing with a caterpillar about its dietary habits, trying to convince the creature that the kale in the neighboring village was much more succulent than his prize-winning hydrangeas. The problem, however, arrived on a Tuesday. The shogun announced a grand samurai inspection. Every warrior in the province must demonstrate their killing spirit to earn their rank. If you fail, you lose your stipend, your sword, and usually your head. Kenji is in deep trouble. His killing spirit is essentially a gardening spirit that wants to put everyone in a warm embrace and give them a pot of herbal tea. He has to pretend he's a bloodthirsty maniac for the general, but every time he looks at a person, he's wondering what kind of fertilizer would make them grow faster. The pressure is mounting. The training camp is filled with men shouting, breaking wooden planks, and trying to look as mean as possible. Kenji is currently sweating through his silk kimono because he accidentally gave the general's prize-winning horse a haircut that the beast didn't ask for. The horse now looks like a bowl-cut monk, and the general is staring at it with the intensity of a man deciding who to execute first. Kenji's first attempt to impress the general was aggressive landscaping. He decided to show off his blade control by slicing a nearby pine tree into the shape of a threatening tiger. He spent 3 days sweating, whispering encouraging words to the bark, and carefully clipping away the needles. It backfired spectacularly when a group of particularly bold sparrows decided the tiger's ear was the perfect location for a luxury hotel. They began nesting in the foliage, chirping loudly, and Kenji, overwhelmed by the beauty of nature's tiny contractors, burst into tears of joy. The general watched from a distance, confused as to why his samurai was weeping in the arms of a topiary. Attempt 2? He tried to use his katana to intimidate a training dummy. He charged, let out a high-pitched squeak that he hoped sounded like a battle cry, and struck the straw effigy. Unfortunately, he immediately felt bad about the damage he had dealt to the straw. He spent the next 40 minutes whispering, "I'm so sorry, little buddy. I'll get the bandages," to the pile of mangled straw, frantically trying to tie the limbs back together with strips of his own sash. He was caught by the general, who was so perplexed by the sight of a man performing field medicine on a piece of agricultural waste that he started questioning his own sanity, wondering if the sake he had for breakfast had been spiked with something hallucinogenic. Third attempt? The fake battle. Kenji hired a local street performer to jump out at him, thinking he could defeat him with a swift, intimidating move. He figured if he just knocked the guy over, it would look like a decisive victory. Instead, Kenji tripped over his own scabbard, a scabbard he had customized to hold pruning shears, and landed on the performer in a tangle of limbs and embarrassment. Panicked by the potential for a scratch, Kenji started giving the man a head massage to apologize for the impolite entrance. The general was now convinced that Kenji wasn't just a bad samurai. He was a secret agent of a rival clan, sent to distract him with bizarre, non-lethal, psychological warfare rituals. The atmosphere in the training ground turned into a slapstick comedy of errors involving spilled manure, barking stray dogs, and a very confused, red-faced shogun official who was ready to order a purge just to get the smell of fertilizer out of his nostrils. Just as the general, his patience entirely evaporated, signaled his guards to drag Kenji to the execution block for extreme incompetence, fate decided to intervene in the most violent way possible. A band of rogue ronin, desperate, hungry, and remarkably rude, stormed the training camp. They weren't interested in honor or inspections. They wanted the shogun's supplies and his head. They burst into the clearing, screaming war cries and swinging rusted, jagged swords. The other samurai, who had spent the last few weeks doing synchronized drills and chanting, were paralyzed. They were so used to this ceremony of war that the reality of it caught them off guard. They stood there like statues as the bandits surged toward the general's pavilion. Kenji stood between the chaos and his master. He drew his blade, his hands shaking so violently that the steel hummed. He looked at the bandit leader, a man whose face was a map of bad decisions, and then he looked at the bandit's sword. His eyes widened. He noticed the bandit had a weird, invasive fungus growing on his blade, a red mold that was clearly rotting the steel from the inside out. Kenji snapped. Not into a rage, but into gardening expert mode. "You fool!" Kenji screamed, his voice echoing across the field. "You're allowing spores to compromise your structural integrity. That blade needs an acidic bath and a proper oiling, or it will shatter in the next parry." He lunged. The bandits were stunned, expecting a strike to the neck, but Kenji was moving to clean. He parried with surgical precision. He didn't strike to maim, he struck to prune. He flicked his blade against the bandit's sword, vibrating the rust loose. He spun, his scabbard acting as a shield, and clipped the loose buttons off the bandit's sleeves because they were distracting the flow of movement. He was guarding the bandits. He moved through them like a whirlwind of agriculture, parrying attacks while lecturing them on soil pH and the dangers of improper drainage. He pruned their loose threads, trimmed their unruly bangs, and even corrected a bandit's stance because, as Kenji put it, "Your spine is going to develop a permanent crook if you hold your sword like that. And believe me, lumbar support is vital for long-term health." The bandits, utterly bewildered by a man who was fighting them like he was trimming a hedge, found themselves disarmed and well-groomed. By the time Kenji was finished, the bandit leader was standing there with no buttons, a perfectly trimmed beard he hadn't asked for, and a sword that was now miraculously clean of rust but completely blunt. The confusion was so total that the bandits simply dropped their weapons and sat down, out of sheer social anxiety and the terrifying realization that they had just been defeated by a man who was worried about their posture. The general stared, his mouth agape. He had seen many battles, but he had never seen anyone prune an entire war party. He assumed he had just witnessed a secret, high-level mastery of sword flow defensive art, a technique so advanced it looked like madness to the untrained eye. He promoted Kenji on the spot to headmaster of strategic defense. Kenji accepted, but only on the condition that the training camp was converted into a sprawling botanical garden where the samurai could learn the patience of a gardener. Kenji became a local hero. He taught his students that if you can prune a bonsai, you can prune an enemy's ego. He taught them that the most dangerous thing in the world is a man who is calm, focused, and utterly obsessed with the health of his surroundings. He remained a samurai, though he still cried whenever a leaf fell off a tree in autumn, and he still carried his shears in his scabbard. The irony was not lost on the history books. Kenji became the most effective protector of the region because he was too busy trying to keep things clean to notice he was winning. The moral of the story is simple. Sometimes, if you want to win a war, you just need a better pair of shears. Or, in Kenji's case, just be so bizarrely, terrifyingly peaceful that nobody dares to fight you because they're afraid you might try to give them a haircut. So, next time someone threatens you, don't reach for a weapon. Start talking about the benefits of organic mulch and the proper way to propagate ferns. It works every time. Mostly. And if it doesn't, well, at least your garden will look beautiful when the dust settles.